I would like to start with a short agenda for today, with an introduction that will be rather done about the power of poetry and plurilingual poetry, more specifically on what poetic inquiry is. I will show you my design of the empirical study, some results around categories such as reflection on identity work, reflection on plurilingual repertoire, reflection on plurilingual pedagogies, and then we will have some time to go to the discussion, to a brief conclusion, and then I will show you the references in the case you want to know more about plurilingual poetry. I was thinking about presenting myself in a rather artistic way. Sorry, I'm not that good on drawing, but here you can see, starting from the very beginning, I always think that of myself and my family as coming from Angola, where my parents met, where I had where my elderly sister was born, and how they had to leave for Portugal after the independence of Angola. Then you will see here, 77, a great year to be born. It's when I was born in Portugal, in the near of Aveiro. And I consider myself the move to primary school as a transformative move in my life, because that's when I met Professora Celeste here at my primary school in Fermentelos, and I got in love with teaching and being a teacher and the care and attention that teachers put in their job. So it was in primary school that I thought the first time, I want to become a teacher. I didn't know of what, but I wanted to become one. And after following my path through different schools, I finally decided that my passion was French, and I decided to become a French teacher. This is me. My hair looks more like this than this usually. And then I entered the University of Aveiro, where I did my teacher education diploma, where I started my PhD. And then you will see here an heart and a guy in a motorbike. This is my husband. We met in Spain, and then we moved to Germany, where I started learning another foreign language. So just to present myself in a more personalized way and entering into the theme of arts-based approaches in education. And just to tell you something, I've been working, and if you are interested in any of these publications, just ask me. I've been working with social justice and also teacher education for plurilingual approaches, and ranging from using linguistic landscapes to what we call pluralistic approaches in language education, mostly intercomprehension. And more recently, I've been also dealing with language teacher identity, as you can see here, and working in or coordinating Erasmus Plus projects in these areas of research. And the most recent is PEP, Promotion de l'Éducation Plurilingue. If you want to know more about these projects, I am also happy to provide you with more information. So for today, as I told you, I'm interested in poetry, plurilingual poetry, as a form of arts-based research. And according to Faulkner, there's a substantial interest in poetry in some research areas in the past 2 decades. But, Danielle Moore just wrote a very, very interesting emotional chapter, stressing that aesthetic explorations, meaning poetry, meaning drawings, meaning all kinds of arts-based approaches, are very still in their early stages. And that's where I and my research will fit in. So in terms of theory, you will ask yourself probably, is there any theory about the artistic and poetic inquiry in applied language studies? And the answer is yes. And we considered, or researchers working with poetry and poetic inquiry, consider it a form of qualitative research, in the social sciences that incorporates poetry in some ways as a component of an investigation. It can be in the planning phases of data collection. It can be as data collection itself, and it can be also to communicate the research of the investigation. And I will show you some examples. So this is one of my favorite books. If you want to work with poetic inquiry, I really recommend it. In which poetic inquiry and following an hour is used or is conceived as a way to represent and reinterpret existing data. It's also a method of data collection, and you can even use poetry to collect field notes or to organize field notes. So you may see that this is before artificial intelligence that would restructure also our field notes with poetry. And this is also something interesting if you read Blackledge and Chris. They also use poetry to compile field notes, for example, in the market, in plurilingual markets. And why would we use poetry in data collection or analysis on the interpretation? Is this not too easy, you might think of? This is not really well established. What do you gain from doing this? And Vincent says that poetry inquiry is not selected just because we want to avoid the stringent, rigorous nature of scientific studies or to diminish our work in doing the analysis, but really because we need it as a method to realize new or different ways of knowing with the potential for a variety of views and voices. And I think we will be able to understand this idea of varieties of views and voices in the poems that I'm going to show you. So wrapping up this multifaceted nature of poetry in social sciences, we can use it as a method and as a product. We can analyze it as a process as well, and a process that inspires reflexivity and introspection while writing and thinking about, in our case, plurilingualism in education and the plurilingual repertoire. And Furman, already in 2006, told us that poetry can be used as a tool and method for representation of research data. For example, you can do your research, come to your conclusions, and that translate your conclusions into a poem. That's not what I have been doing, but I will open up some reflections in this direction. It can be a source of data, and it can be a source for data analysis. And you will see I mix poetry and poetic inquiry as a source of data and a source for data analysis. Well, plurilingual poetry inquiry can be said, or is indeed, an arts-based approach. I've been using more visuals and drawings, but now I am focusing on the combination also with poetry, and it's part of the aesthetic paradigm in plurilingual education. This is an expression that I took from Dom Martin Normand et Nathalie Tamand, and you can see some examples of this aesthetic paradigm in plurilingual education. In terms of definition, I just very recently came across this definition by Albuquerque and Moore in Barcelona, who defined plurilingual poetry as that in which a poem that may use different languages or different varieties of languages in a single composition. And in terms of what we know about identity text, for example, a plurilingual poem can be considered also a narrative of the self, and a narrative of the self that presents a performative writing of the encompassing the multilingual repertoire. And we can have a receptive and a productive approach to plurilingual poetry, because if you are just analyzing plurilingual poetry, you are rather in the receptive modus, and you try to make sense of what has been written. And you can also think of the production of the plurilingual poem in language education. And I think it is important to think even of both in terms of ownership, because you can grasp the production of the plurilingual poetry if you are if you analyze the production. Of course, you can also, even if you don't share the same linguistic repertoires with the author, you can still try to fill what I call the intersubjective spaces of void through your own creativity, through your own linguistic repertoires, paying attention to the languages of the other. And in some research strands, the authors call this a challenge when the producer and the recipient do not share the same linguistic repertoires, and then you cannot understand the poem in its completeness. But if you read about poetry and poetic inquiry, and also in poetic lyrical expression, there is always spaces of void when you read poetry and when you create poetry. It's not something that is just literal. You always fill the meaning with other languages or your own imagination. So there's no such a thing as I could understand everything, even in poetry, and not at all in poetic inquiry. So in the poems that I'm going to present you, and I'm immersed in these poems from such a time, I also don't understand everything. But these intersubjective spaces of void is where I can exert my ownership of the poem, where I can also make sense of the plurilingual repertoire of the other. So from my perspective, using poetry in education and this plurilingual poetry, it's a way of merging creative writing and creative reading, if you want, and interpretations, and to gain access to processes of thinking, reconstruction, co-construction of sense across languages. And there is indeed not a lot of research using plurilingual poetry in applied language studies. I bring two very recent examples, one from Kubo-Kava, in which the teacher works with plurilingual poetry in the English classroom to empower newly arrived students in secondary school, to show that their problems while writing or in writing a text is very similar also to other students, and she tries to empower the newcomers as authors and as someone who have a repertoire and can make sense of their linguistic lives. And more recently, Albuquerque and Emily Moore in Barcelona, they applied plurilingual poetry in an adults course with adult migrants learning Spanish and Catalan in Barcelona. So it is used as, they even explain it here in the first line, using poetry to engage learners' full linguistic repertoires and interacting about this to support their language learning. So it's used as a strategy, a reflexive strategy, to gain insights into learning processes in plurilingual adult minds. You will see that my approach is a little bit different, but it really has a lot to do with these studies that I just showed you. So let me go to my Design do Estudo Empírico and show you how everything was thought of. It was developed through or during the pandemic with French and Spanish student teachers in classes called L'approche par compétences en cours de FLE ou bien enfoques plurales en clase DL, español lengua extranjera. And I asked the students to think of this theme, this global theme, living together, and write a poem using the languages of their plurilingual repertoire. And after this, I used the poems from them as a prompt to reflect about their plurilingual writing strategies, the word choice, language choice, combinations, and then in another phase, how they could use this task also for Spanish or French language teachers at school. And I'm not focusing on this third part of the task. I'm focusing more on the process of reflecting about language choice and which ideologies and which strategies were used by the student teachers. The reflections, they could be written in German, French, and Spanish for the purposes of this seminar. And as you can see, there was a clear encouragement of plurilingual writing. In some studies using poetry, it is more about, when we talk about plurilingualism, it's about, okay, write a poem in your first language, sometimes called mother tongue, and then translate it to the language of schooling. And in my case, my scenarios was really about, let's use all the languages. You can use all the languages of your linguistic repertoire to create something new, something that you can relate to in a more holistic way. And you can also see that it is not a scenario in which all the students have a migrant background, or they needed to have a migrant background to accomplish the task. Because what I wanted to show is that plurilingual education is valuable for everybody, not just for newcomers, adults, or children. Plurilingual education presents assets for everybody, not just for kids or adults with a migrant background trying to learn the language of the school or of the welcoming, hosting society. I wanted to show that everybody, with or without a migrant background, will be able to write a plurilingual poem, will be able to gain insights into plurilingualism and how a plurilingual mind works. And well, this is what it was done. So an example, you can see here the poem as a product. You have a poem as it would be Baudelaire. Just think about a poem that you find in a poem compilation. You have this, and then you have on the right side the poem as a process in which the students reflect on their process of creating the poem, selection of languages, of words, you name it, while writing a poem. As I told you, some of these reflections were written in German, some in Spanish, some in French. For the sake of this presentation, I translated those productions into English. So about the results, I had to bring this because it was the first time I discovered that I love poetry. It was with Annabel Lee from Edgar Allan Poe, and I just love this poem. So something that we can see is that a poem is about applying consciously or unconsciously meter, cadence, line length, alliteration, speed, assonance. So everything that is typical of poetry and linguistic and poetic language. And then you can also think of using the first or the third person while creating your poem. And this is important in the sense of giving a voice about who is talking. And since I wanted to explore the plurilingual repertoire, I think this is important to keep in mind. In the poem here, Living Juntos, you can see that she's very structural. So you could find this in also any compilations, because she has what does it mean in 3 languages, what does it mean, que significa, was heißt das? And then all the verses are bilingual. English, all the verses are bilingual in the continuation, with the idea of alliteration, structure. Sometimes they rhyme, sometimes they don't, but she has a method. And I will show you how she reflected about this method. So just to give you some of the sonority of this poem, what does it mean? Living together means compartir el mismo lugar. Living together means using the same tools. Living together means dieselbe Sprache zu teilen. ¿Qué significa? Vivir juntos significa zusammenzuarbeiten. Vivir juntos significa pasar tiempo juntos. Vivir juntos significa laughing together, and so forth and so on. So she tried to follow the same structure, combine bilingual verses, and give her sense of living together, vivir juntos, using the third voice, because she never says I or we. It's about the meaning of living together. So it's one of the poems. Here you can see by another student, conviver é uma coisa linda. It was a student who was having a friend who was teaching to be a Spanish and French teacher. And at that time, because I was the teacher, she decided to try out Portuguese as well. So you can see some Portuguese mixed up in the poem and being used in different parts. And here in red, you see that she mixes different voices, the we and I and the other. And she constructs the poem around the idea of how beautiful it can be to live together. And also here there's a break in the meaning, and she says living together can also include a shock, and then she explains how it can be a shock and what kind of strategies you can use. Important is that you find common ground, is like the sort of message that she wants to convey. And you see that she has verses that are monolingual, she has verses that mixed up languages, and they are merged aesthetically, like Zusammenleben is a very nice thing. And you can see in the continuation as well. I'm not reading all this because it's a lot, but you can see that she tries also to introduce some rhymes. So coming to understand how they created the plurilingual poems, they have very different approaches, I may say. So while for the student with this huge poem, she wrote all these 5 strophes. And she says, I just started and wrote the poem relatively quickly. I think it took me 10 to 15 minutes. And while writing and rhyming with other languages, I come up with new ideas. So she says that writing in multiple languages just gave her new ideas on how to develop the poem even further. And she came to the idea of stress, and then further verses were created. And then sometimes they feel happy, sometimes they feel frustrated because the words don't rhyme as they wanted it to rhyme. It doesn't always sound that good due to different speech melodies and stresses. So you can see that they start reflecting about how languages combine with each other. And then she said, my head was simply changing the language in each line. So she found it quite naturally to change languages and not to follow a monolingual, monoglossic pattern. And just to show you how complex the process can be and how much thought the students put in the process of writing. Let me just read the second one. I will read it completely because it's really interesting. I choose the languages in the order in which I acquired them, using a different language for each line because I speak the 4 languages every day. I started with a different language at the beginning of each verse, and I wrote the last line of the last verse in German because it is the last language I acquired. Quite structured and thought. The effect I was looking for was actually that of rhythm and melody. To achieve this, I paid attention to the stressed syllables of each sentence so that it would sound good despite the language changes. So all the ideas that sometimes language mixing can seem unnatural, but they can sound good, they can be harmonious. So my primary goal is actually to achieve harmony between languages. And you will see that this idea of harmony between languages will have an impact on how they think about linguistic hierarchies and exclusion and inclusion of languages in everyday lives. Let me read this one as well. So Aka here, she didn't follow the instructions, so she decided not to write about living together because it was almost Christmas. And she thought that she should have much stronger connection to the festivities. So she wrote ein Weihnachtsgedicht. And I will just read the first one. Laughter, lightning, love and kisses, bunte Lichter, Weihnachtsschmuck, olor a vela en las narices, the world is bathed in a beautiful look. So she makes Spanish rhyme with English, English with German, and you see that she is making an attempt really to create a poetry that rhymes, that has a rhythm, a structure. And it's not the same student here. I will present it. Just read the second here, how she explains the pleasure coming from the activity. At the beginning, I found the task a bit strange. But as I slowly got into it, the funny rhymes emerged. I really enjoyed writing it and had to laugh at myself a few times. So it's really positivity, positive psychology in language learning programs, not just talking about barriers and obstacles, really going behind this idea of everything is a challenge in plurilingual education and showing how joyful it can be. And you can see how the students as well enter in a very literary analysis of their own poems, thinking about schemes of rhymes. For example, I used one of the 3 languages in each strophe, alternating between them. I used the rhyme scheme AB in the first verse and AABB in the second. So they really sort of actualized the knowledge that they had of poetry analysis, and they consider this knowledge to create their poems. And they use all the language that I speak. You will see that it's not always that harmonious. I will bring you some of examples. And then just also in the last example, I love the idea that content and the theme and the use of languages should support each other. So it is from this student, remember in the beginning, who wrote the very structured poem with living together, vivir juntos, zusammenleben, glaube ich. She describes the process of the poetic writing. Each verse consists of 3 lines, each ending in a different language, in addition to the formulated question of what living together means. With this stylistic device, I have tried to create the effect that the languages can also live together and support and promote each other. So bringing the languages together creatively in such a production can be abstract, can be used to think of how languages in society can also live together. So she made this transposition of the task to the to plurilingualism or multilingualism in society. So you can see the reflection taking place. Here is one of these poems where I think, well, let fill this void. I cannot read Farsi, but it's there and it adds to the plurilingualism of, and it's a proof of the plurilingualism of the student. And I have to say that some students decided not to use Arabic because they think it's too complicated for the others, and they auto-exclude some languages of their linguistic repertoires because of this. And I have to praise FMA because she decided it's not about what you can understand, it's about how I feel about my languages and what I can bring to the poetry. And she says, I incorporated almost all the languages I know. And here you can ask yourself, why almost all? Why not all the languages? What are the reasons to exclude languages? And we will see some after this, but she says, okay, I included German and Farsi as my mother tongues, English and Spanish as foreign languages. She's starting to become a teacher of these two languages. I also wanted to include French at first, but I didn't do it after all. I'm not sure exactly why. So it's just a forgotten language. I don't really know why I forget about it. And then she also explains how she produced the poem and how the linguistic messages and pickings meet the message that she wants to convey. The topic living together made me think of unity among humankind and peace. That is why I did not separate the languages into separate strophes, but wrote a single strophe with the verses in different languages. The intention is that the form of the poem reflects the content. And then, look, you also have some reflections about the role of English in this plurilingual world. The English in the middle of the poem is intended to represent the center, English as a center language for humanity. So you can see that while writing a poem using the linguistic repertoire at their disposal, she also shares some of the language ideologies and beliefs she holds about some of the languages. French, apparently you can leave it aside. I didn't even remember why I forgot to include it. And then English as the center. And another student says, first, I wanted to write a poem in which no particular language dominated. So writing a poem with the suppose all languages of the repertoire was an occasion to think about language domination, about hierarchies, about power of some languages over others. And they wanted to deconstruct this power in the productions, what was not always successful, because afterwards she tried this and then she says, nothing meaningful came of it. So I decided to use the main language for the poem after all, just to have a starting point. But the starting point was, let's avoid linguistic hierarchies in the poems. So while talking about their plurilingual self, their plurilingual identity, they come up with very interesting explanations also why they left some languages and varieties out of the poem. And for example, this student says, I used all 4 languages that I speak. So you see here the prevalence of productive over receptive repertoires. Although I also understand a lot of Portuguese, French, and Italian, I don't speak these languages and therefore didn't use them. It is also noticeable in retrospect that at no time did I think about using regional variants of Catalan or Spanish that I know. That is, at the time, I somehow felt inwardly that these provincial dialects did not belong in the mix, which is not true. So it reflects about the process of exclusion, of excluding some languages, and acknowledges that they should be present. This is what I read from, which is not true. So analyzing the poem as a product afterwards, he came to the conclusion that he left some important parts of the plurilingual repertoire aside, following this ideology that some of these languages or varieties are just provincial dialects and shouldn't not integrate the poem. And this is also a very interesting Phi talks about, she's becoming a teacher of French and Spanish. And she says that through the academic path, she's always been told to keep the languages separate. Do not mix Spanish and French just because they belong to the same linguistic family. And you can see how she reflects about this. Since French and Spanish are very similar, I sometimes have the problem of switching from one to the next seminar. So keep the language separate because you are in different seminars at university. You see the importance, or how the university and teacher education programs can influence your linguistic ideology by saying, do not mix languages, you are in a different seminar, keep them separated, please, and with a strong monolingual and monoglossic habitus in the curriculum, almost being imposed upon the students. And then she says, often I mix them unconsciously or use the Spanish word instead of the French without realizing. And she really reflects on, it's almost like, how could I tell it? It's really a conflict, being plurilingual and then constantly working with the brain to keep the languages separated in different times. And then about this identity exploration made possible through plurilingual identity, plurilingual poetry, I loved this last quote in which the student writes, the poem reminded me of my semester abroad in Spain, in Granada, a place I didn't know, but where I never felt out of place because the language allowed me access. So this idea of languages having to do with belonging, with feeling connected, having access to the people and to the country, in this case, to Granada. And finally, when they reflect about the connections between language, plurilingualism, and creativity, I just wanted you to read closely the first quote, in which we clearly see that the use of adverbs stress the surprising effect of writing a plurilingual poem. So I use 5 languages here: German, English, French, Spanish, and Portuguese, because I wanted to see if I could really integrate all of them, and it actually worked. So it's this surprise, the effect of being able to use the linguistic repertoire. Some might say, well, but linguistic repertoire, but she's keeping languages separated and identifying them by names and saying it's German and English and French. But it's the way students talk about their plurilingual repertoires, and they can still identify each languages, the languages, and separate them. So we could think of discussions going on. If you think of translanguaging, is this unitary? Do we need to separate the languages? And clearly, languages have an identity for the students using them. This could be interesting for the discussion. And then when talking about languages, plurilingual education, they start to imagine the impact of such an open activity in the school context and how playful it could be, and also be connected with emotions, for example. And the second student stresses, I can well imagine that students would also enjoy writing a poem with the languages they speak. This would also include languages that are not taught at school. The students act as mediators and representatives of all their languages, especially those that other students do not know. So they can explain what they have written and why, and engage in cross-linguistic mediation, for example. In addition, the students learn to observe and analyze languages and thus recognize similarities and differences between them. So all related to cross-linguistic comparisons and cross-linguistic or meta-linguistic awareness. And you can then analyze words rhyming across languages more closely. Yes, and then there's another quote here, but I think I'm going to leave you with the quote. Just focus on what I've signaled in red. No matter which languages and how good the language level, if they are using this task, we are making this task in the classroom, in the short form of a poem, everything has the same value and expressiveness. So all languages are able to create emotions, to convey emotions, are at the same level of expressiveness, and they are not, or the student tries not to range the languages in terms of expressiveness, because all of them are connected to emotions, the plurilingual repertoire, and so on. And I told you that it's not always beautiful to say, well, it's not, students not always speak about the languages they pick up for the poem. Sometimes they also reflect on why they leave languages behind and do not use them. And in a recent work with Van der Tavares, we came to 4 reasons why they decide to exclude some languages while writing the poem. And I think these motivations to exclude the languages are deeply connected to beliefs about what is the plurilingual repertoire and what belongs to. And if you see, for example, the first one, and I read one example of it, it's about the devaluation of partial repertoire. So I just use the languages that I know productively, and even if I know some bits of other languages, even if I know I can understand Portuguese or French and Italian, I just use the languages that I know in a productive way. And then another belief about the plurilingual repertoire that seems to emerge is this maximalist view of language competences. I'm just able, and I will just use the languages that I can speak pretty much, the languages that I can use well, the languages in which I could almost approach a native-like level. So this is what I call here the disregard of bits of languages in different languages. So using individual words in another language didn't seem to make much sense to me. So let's exclude everything that it's perceived as a bit of language with a disconnection of the productive competences that I can make compete with L1 speakers. Then there's the idea that, and it emerges a lot in my corpus, that languages that should be used in the poem are languages that are rather included in the school curriculum. So if my languages are not included in the school curriculum, I shouldn't be using them. And this creates also hierarchies in the acknowledgement of multilingualism. Language with power, with same status, are included in the school curriculum. If they are not, well, let's let these languages aside. So this is why in the poem that you saw in my corpus, the most present languages are German as the language of the majority language, English, French, and even Spanish as foreign languages. But heritage languages, for example, are almost systematically erased because the students claim, I just have partial competences, I cannot compete with the native, I limited myself to languages of the school like English, French, and German. And then they come up also with the ideas that are very strongly reproduced somehow also in academia. Well, it's not an Indo-European language, so nobody will understand. So it's not even easy to understand. And this is how they say, it's a minority language. You don't need to use it. So it's really focusing on creation of hierarchies, using even linguistic categories like Indo-European languages and such kind of meta-linguistic explanations. And then last but not least, because I think all the three above are connected to the last one, the native speakerism and multilingualism, they valued or they tend to value the model of the native speaker. And this is why some students, for example, explain, I have used all the languages I have learned or speak as a native speaker. So you see, if it's bit of languages, if I don't have the maximalist perspective of the languages in my repertoire, if I do not value the receptive skills, I don't even try to write the words down. So it's really a way of excluding and including languages. And you can see that plurilingualism per se, and even if the task is so open and allows for the use of the full plurilingual repertoire, they find some ways, and they justify it with some beliefs about plurilingual repertoire and what belongs to it. So coming to the discussion, I would say that just to finish, and perhaps we will have some time for discussion afterwards, that this creative act of blending languages in poetry are powerful is a powerful tool for reflecting about the plurilingual identity, about the performance of the plurilingual self. So I see these poems as performing writing of the plurilingual self, in which they decide on exclusion, inclusion of languages, on rhymes, on why they choose certain formats and certain structures. It's also a powerful avenue for challenging monolingual and monoglossic biases, because they say, and now to writing the plurilingual poetry, I keep myself thinking, yeah, you have now to change the language. So it's really a mechanical operation almost, in which the students recall themselves of the heteroglossic contract and get away or try to escape the monoglossic biases. They also gain appreciation for the fluid nature of the language use. So they reflect about the effects of combining languages. They combine those languages and then reflect about this combination, referring to the aim or the message of the poem. And it's also a very interesting way, in my perspective, to analyze the construction of these student teachers' plurilingual competence, not only in the social affective dimension, like which emotions, which beliefs do they transmit while reflecting and constructing the poem, but also on how they think about languages they learned. Sometimes they say, I just use the languages that I learned, not the languages that I acquired. So if it's your heritage language and you didn't go to school, it's an acquired language and you should leave it aside. So you start to think on how they think about languages and how they combine the linguistic and communicative repertoires. But there is always a but. The ideologies and beliefs about plurilingualism and about what is a plurilingual person also provoke self-inflicted reduction of the languages used for creative purposes. And that's why in this paper with Van der Tavares, we refer to ideologies of multilingualism or plurilingualism as offering opportunities for both epistemic inclusion and exclusion. And I can give you some more examples in the discussion phase. So what I think it has to be discussed as well, now that I'm coming to the conclusion, is the role of the writing prompt itself, because the prompt was write about living together. I was wondering what would happen if I would ask them to write about Christmas time or your favorite book. So how does the prompt influence the way they write about the languages and they deploy the different languages? And while reflecting on the poems themselves and the analysis my student teachers wrote, I think that poetry, because they always talk about the verses and the stanzas, so they talk about poetry as also fragmented and something you can visualize. So this allows the student teachers to reflect about, I put it invented because I love the book Invented, about the invention of monolingualism, and I used it here in the same sense, invented linguistic hierarchies. It's also a very interesting avenue to think about language choices, the dynamics of inclusion and exclusions. And what is very dear to me, these aesthetics of blending and merging of languages and how they create plurilingual rhymes and rhythm and metrics that fit their expressive needs. And I couldn't see it in all the poems, but it's also important to see that poetry allows the students to go from one voice to the other, to merge different voices, to accommodate different voices, and to talk from the plurilingual repertoire, from their own perspective, and then from the perspective of the students that they envision in the future. So to finish, I think that by now, and I hope you are convinced, that poetry can be understood as an interpretive act of critical thinking, and we could see how student teachers critically think about the plurilingual repertoire, the implementation of plurilingual tasks in the class, about the pleasure they could give their students in the future if they give them the opportunity also to write such a poem. And I would consider, and at this phase, the neologism that well, I created that happened once. I can explain how this theoretical approach in which theory and ethical are merged, to think about bringing together theory that makes sense, the theory on the plurilingual competence, on cross-linguistic mediation, theory that has a very scientific and acknowledged value, and then the ethical concerns related to teacher education and how we can bring both together through a plurilingual poetry. And in my perspective, this theoretical lens merges theory and ethical, and it's related to these three education principles that we could think of, models, theories, tasks, and materials that better suit the needs of language education. Also theoretical in the sense that it is up to us and universities and in teacher education programs to prepare the teachers to respond to the linguistic diversity and the cultural diversity and their students, and then to see it as inescapable across the curriculum in diverse educational settings. And to finish, I would say that without using, from my side, I was trying to not intervene in the writing of the poems and in the discussions. Let us remember that it was in the pandemic. I opened this discussion forum where they put their poems and exchanged about them. And student teachers arrived at their own understanding of plurilingualism and heteroglossia without an excessive researcher influence. So while discussing and sharing their experiences, their plurilingual experiences, they collaboratively and through their own reflection came to the conclusion or to this need of implementing plurilingual education at schools. And through experiencing pleasure during the task, through their emotional investment, I think that this can be a way forward to leave just discourses of challenges, problems, limitations, and anxieties while implementing plurilingual pedagogies and bring positive psychology in teacher education, because they could have this wonderful taste of feeling successful when creating their poem, when sharing their expressions. They got so much positive feedback from their peers. And then this can be also a way forward in developing creative, experiential language teacher education that focus on plurilingualism. Not just, and while it is important to have a very strong theoretical background, I think it's also important to see what plurilingualism in this sense makes with us as plurilingual teachers and plurilingual speakers, plurilingual individuals. And as ways forward, I was thinking, well, Silvia, what can you say about ways forward with this research? And I would love to do these tasks with students at schools in very different contexts to see if they follow the same patterns of language inclusion and exclusion, if they reproduce the same language beliefs or beliefs about plurilingualism. I would love to create an exhibition with these poems in my institutions, just to have everybody admire and appreciate the aesthetics of merging and blending, as I told you, and somehow leave this monoglossic, monolingual habitus behind, to quote a colleague from me. And then I was thinking, how would this look like if I translated my own research and my own results into poetic forms? How would it look like? And I'm still not doing this, but I'm very curious about my own ability of translating and using poetic inquiry to disseminate the results as suggested in the theory when I told you about the different ways of using poetic inquiry. So this is everything for today. I just wanted, to finish with this quote that I appropriated for my research, that really going through this journey, and it's been 3 years now that I'm working with plurilingual poetry, made me rediscover this pleasure in doing research, showcasing our inability to make the world intelligible, opening up ways to brace for unexpected results, zones of discomfort because I cannot understand all the languages used by my students, and to think that that's the way plurilingualism also works. We don't always have to understand everything, but we have to open, and not just open, to really to connect to what we already can, and think that sometimes that's the way it is. Some words will be unintelligible, and it's open to uncertainty. So I just finish with this quote, and I bring some references that I use to this presentation.